The opera Dr. Atomic deals with the final days of the development of the atom bomb in the highly secretive Manhattan Project at Los Alamos, New Mexico, near the end of World War II. Dr. Atomic explores a momentous event in the world of science, in the world of history, the development of the first atom bomb. With characters such as J. Robert Oppenheimer, director of Los Alamos, General Leslie Groves, director of the Manhattan Project, physicist Edward Teller, Robert Wilson, Dr. Atomic explores brilliant, complex human beings and complex themes. This session will actually discuss the making of the opera Dr. Atomic. I'm most pleased to introduce our moderator for this panel, the visionary general manager of the Met, who in his brief tenure has worked to bring the opera to millions of new listeners around the world through the Met Live in HD, Peter Gelb.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Brian. And I would like to thank Matthew Goldstein, the Chancellor of CUNY, who, together with Brian, have been responsible for these symposia. And I'd also like to thank the Sloan Foundation, which has been a great sponsor and supporter of our production of Dr. Atomic, particularly Paul Joskow and Doran Weber, who oversees the Foundation's Public Understanding of Science and Technology program. You know, obviously, I know that you are, many of you are scientists and experts in the atomic bomb. Clearly, I am not. And the group of people you're seeing on the stage here represent this great creative effort. John Adams, to my left, is one of the most remarkable composers of modern times. He is the leading and most distinguished composer of opera as well as symphonic composing in America today. And he wrote the opera Dr. Atomic several years ago. It received its premiere in 2004 in San Francisco. And when I was appointed the general manager of the Metropolitan Opera, also in 2004, I was determined to change the artistic profile of the Met, which up until that time had been one of the leading opera houses in the world. It always has been, but also one of the more conservative ones in recent decades. And I was determined to replenish the role of opera in society at the Met by expanding our repertoire, by embracing the most important new compositions, and bringing in great directors and designers to work at the Met. John was way ahead of that process because he's been doing that all his life. Through his great operas, he has many of which have been inspired by real-life historical events. He has connected the culture of opera and the culture of our society in a way that no other composer has been able to in modern times. To John's left is Penny Woolcock, who is a remarkable director of films of various subjects, and she made a film of one of John's operas, which is The Death of Klinghoffer, which is a remarkable film. And the reason why, because of that film, I invited her to direct this new production of Dr. Atomic at the Met. And to her left is Julian Crouch, who is one of the most interesting and unusual scenic designers, who comes from the world of alternative theater, and now has. What's interesting about I think all of these interesting artists next to me, and you're going to hear much more from them, much less from me in a few minutes, is that they all, in their own way, are kind of artistic revolutionaries. And probably if you had asked any one of them a few years ago if they would imagine that they would be working at the Metropolitan Opera, they would have looked at you in disbelief because their work is so vivid and individualistic and non-mainstream. So my own revolutionary tendencies are to try to harness unusual artists, or not harness them, but invite them. Little Freudian slip there. To invite them to work at the Met, to really bring their individuality and extraordinary ideas and imagination to change really the shape of opera. So I'm very thrilled that all three of them are here with me today. Before you start hearing from them, I wanted to show you a little video which will give you, obviously, you're all at a disadvantage because you have not seen the opera. In fact, none of us have seen the opera. The opera has its premiere on Monday. One of the great enemies at the Met is time. So we only, in the dress rehearsal, finally, which took place on Thursday, finally saw all the elements of it come together. And even since then, there have been a few little changes. So the Monday night's performance, the premiere of this new production, will be the first time that audiences and the creative team itself will have seen the work in its final version. And on Thursday at the dress rehearsal, we had a camera test for the high definition transmission of Dr. Atomic, because one of my goals at the Met is not only to present mainstream opera in movie theaters around the world, which is one of the new initiatives the Met has undertaken, as Brian referred to, but also to present all the unusual and new operas that we're producing on the stage of the Met as well. So through this camera test we had on Thursday, we crafted together a little movie-style trailer that we're going to show you right now. And it is actually today. I just came from a transmission of Richard Strauss's Salome, and the audience that saw Salome around the world, which will also be seeing Dr. Atomic in 800 movie theaters live in 30 different countries, saw at the beginning of the Salome broadcast this trailer that you're about to see right now. So we'll play it. They haven't seen it.
They say that.
I should also apologize for the fact that Gerald Finley, the wonderful Canadian baritone who plays the title role of Dr. Atomic, is not here today as advertised. And the reason for that is a very good one, which is that he is resting in preparation for his premiere on Monday. So I hope you will have your understanding that, that he's not with us for that reason, which is a good one. As far as I'm concerned, as the general manager of the Opera House. So I think I'd like to start, if I could. You know, John has a wonderful book, which I'm sure any of you who read the newspapers have read about reviews of in the last few days, called Hallelujah Junction. And in the book, he actually talks about his creative journey, including Dr. Atomic. And I thought maybe you might just talk, start at the beginning and tell us what inspired you to write this piece.
Well, it was actually not my idea. I wish I could take credit for it, but it was suggested to me by Pamela Rosenberg, who was at the time just beginning her tenure at the San Francisco Opera as general director. She was to the San Francisco Opera what Peter is to the Met. And Pamela called me and said that she was hoping to do a series of operas around the Faust theme, and she wanted to commission an American Faust. In other words, she wanted me to write an opera on an American theme, but that had Faust as its, as its fundamental sort of background. And that she suggested this very story, the story of J. Robert Oppenheimer. And Pamela's reasons for associating Oppenheimer to Faust were largely due to the fact that she felt that Oppenheimer was very much, particularly like Goethe's Faust, a extraordinarily intelligent and almost bored scientist, just someone who was so clever and so knowledgeable that life almost didn't have any challenges. And then the devil comes and says, well, I'll give you ultimate knowledge in exchange for which, you give me your soul. And Pamela saw in the story of Robert Oppenheimer, particularly the fact that, he had grown up in a sort of very hothouse garden life, living, being born into a wealthy secular Jewish family here in New York, attending the ethical culture school, going to Harvard, graduating from Harvard at an absurdly young age, going off and becoming this brilliant. And as we heard earlier this afternoon in an earlier panel, at times a very arrogant young man. And then suddenly the U.S. Army, or I should put it this way, suddenly the devil, in the shape in the person of the U.S. Army, comes and says, essentially, we'll allow you to make the all-time greatest scientific experiment, and you can assemble anyone you want to assist you, and we'll give you all the material available, providing that you give us, an atomic bomb at the end. And Oppenheimer makes the decision, the bomb is used, and then he feels terrible remorse. Which, I don't know, does Faust feel that in the opera or not, or is he not?
We never find out.
We never find out, okay. I immediately was drawn to this. I had doubts about the Faust analogy, which I'll explain later, but, I think if opera is going to have any tradition in our time, and particularly in this country, it really has to address the issues of our lives. And that's why I've composed operas like Nixon in China, which are not only about famous characters that we all know from the news, but also are about the main themes of our lives. For example, in Nixon in China, the theme is really, the market economy versus the social welfare economy, capitalism versus communism. And my second opera was about terrorism, about Americans caught up in a cauldron which they were in part responsible for making, but not these particular tourists that got hijacked, not quite knowing what was going on. And I was immediately drawn to this story because of the bomb. I think that there is no more emphatic symbol of what we are as Americans, both in the good sense, in the sense of our industry, our imagination, our Yankee ingenuity, our grit, our determination, and certainly during the period of World War II, our desire, to save civilization from fascism and tyranny. And yet at the same time, the bomb is also this terrible symbol of the darker side, of the potential destruction of the planet, of the awesome burden that we as Americans carry for having been the first to use the bomb. So I was drawn to that, and after reading, and I have to say that my first portal of entry was the marvelous book, The Making of the Atomic Bomb, by Richard Rhodes, who was here at 1 o'clock this afternoon for an earlier seminar. I hope some of you were able to hear Richard do one of his just unbelievably enlightening talks where he can take you through the most complex engineering project and make you feel you actually understood it. But after reading, I felt that the Faust analogy was a stretch, because I think that Oppenheimer and those young scientists really did feel they were in a race to save civilization. They really thought they were building the bomb in a race with Hitler. And of course what happens, and what becomes the story of Dr. Atomic, is that these younger scientists, when they find out that the bomb is actually not going to be used on the Germans because the war is over, but it's going to be dropped on civilians in Japan, some of them become outraged, and they look to Oppenheimer as their spiritual mentor and find out from him that he's in favor of dropping the bomb on civilians. So it becomes a very controversial moral issue.
What distinguished Oppenheimer from the other scientists? Why did you focus on him particularly?
Well, first of all, he's just this unbelievably charismatic person. I mean, there's so many books now about him. In fact, the other day after the dress rehearsal, this man came up to me and he said, which books did you read about Oppenheimer? And so I listed about 4 or 5, and he said, you didn't read mine? Everybody wants to read about him because he was very charismatic. He was incredibly eloquent, he was brilliant, he was mysterious, he was mercurial. He could be on one moment absolutely gracious and caring, and then the next moment just cut you to smithereens with withering sarcasm. He made great martinis. His wife had been married to a communist organizer. His brother was a communist. And then, of course, he's the great American tragic story, a man who was, went to the absolute peak of notoriety, had his picture on the cover of Life magazine, was considered, the egghead. I think the term egghead was actually coined because, he was bald, and I think it was coined just to apply to him. And then, of course, he was destroyed. During the Cold War period, these envious, petty politicians in Washington just couldn't handle his arrogance, and they brought up information about him that was already 20 years old, dating from the 30s, and implicating him as it's, pardon me for using a very sort of trite analogy, but it's kind of like them going after Obama for his William Ayers. It's like, well, you did that. You actually passed this person on the street in such and such, and therefore you must be a terrorist sympathizer. And that, Oppenheimer had hosted cocktail parties in which maybe some Communist Party fundraising went in, but I mean, there are several people in the room here who already this afternoon have confessed to me that they were communists during the 30s. So it's, intellectuals did that. But I mean, Oppenheimer is just a fantastically interesting character, and as an opera composer, I just absolutely wanted to go there and go deep into this person's psyche.
I'd like to ask Penny, and as the director of this new production, and Julian as the designer, how they approached the telling of the story, the retelling of the story. But before I do that, I'd like you to explain the libretto, because this is, one of the most dramatic events in history, as you said, and at the same time, the libretto is not a conventional libretto by any means. So could you explain that to the audience?
Well, the libretto is the creation of my longtime collaborator, Peter Sellers. And Peter and I made, 6 stage works together. The first 2, we had a librettist, the wonderful poet Alice Goodman. And then Alice decided she wanted to go in different directions in her life, much to my eternal chagrin. And we were left to our improvisation to create libretti. But I'm sure there is no other opera libretto anywhere in the literature like this, because this opera is based, it's not based, it's literally the very words that these characters said. So when Edward Teller sings, the text actually comes from his memoirs. And several places where Oppenheimer sings, we're actually quoting things that he said, either from secondhand sources, people who were there and said that Oppenheimer said such and such, or even from transcripts from Washington committee meetings that up till a few years ago were top secret. And then, in addition to that, there's a lot of poetry. And this was not a great leap, because Oppenheimer was probably the most aesthetically cultured scientist that ever lived. I probably more than Einstein or Newton or even Aristotle. I mean, he was widely cultured in literature, in paintings. His family owned a Cézanne and a Van Gogh and many other works of art. He wrote sonnets when he was, a freshman at Harvard. He was the sort of kid we would have tried to take behind the house and beat up. So throughout the opera, when he sort of goes into either a fret or a vision, we have him sing his favorite poetry. So he sings Baudelaire, who was, the rumor was he actually had a volume of Baudelaire in his pocket on the night of the Trinity detonation. He sings the Bhagavad Gita. He doesn't sing the Bhagavad Gita. The chorus does, but they're singing this verse about Shiva, and the way we see it, and the way I think Penny set that is, it's a hallucinogenic vision. Hallucinatory vision of Oppenheimer. I'll give you an example of that. I hope I can find it here. It's amazing. I've been working with words all my life. I speak them all right, but I can never remember my libretti.
That's why it's written down.
Where the hell is this?
Feelings of heat and cold, pleasure and pain, are you looking for?
Yes. No. Shape Stupendous. That's right.
You carry on talking.
Okay. And what you saw at the very end of the trailer was Oppenheimer alone with his awful creation. It's the first moment, perhaps in 2 years, that this man has been alone, that somebody hasn't been pestering him, or the army hasn't been calling him and telling him how the bomb absolutely has to be ready by such and such a date. And he has this existential moment. He's completely alone. This is the very end of Act 1. And you see this huge plutonium sphere looming, hanging from a tower. And he sings this poem by John Donne, Batter My Heart, Three-Person God, which I treat as a somewhat archaic aria. It's like an artifact from the past. And it seems absolutely natural that a man as cultivated and also as sort of otherworldly as Oppenheimer was, that he could just switch back from talking hard nuts and bolts science to quoting Baudelaire or the Bhagavad Gita. By the way, Oppenheimer did read Sanskrit. He learned Sanskrit so that he could read the Bhagavad Gita. So this is the chorus sort of just bursts forth with this verse from the Bhagavad Gita. At the sight of this, your shape stupendous, full of mouths and eyes, feet, thighs, and bellies, terrible with fangs, all the worlds are fear-struck, even as I am. When I see you, Vishnu, omnipresent, shouldering the sky in hues of rainbow, with your mouths agape and flame eyes staring, all my peace is gone. My heart is troubled. I mean, if that's not the image of the atomic blast. So, but then I'll give you another instance. This is the very opening of the opera, and the chorus sings this, and it'll give you an idea. This comes from a 1945 book that I found. I even have the original copy of it, called Atomic Energy for Military Purposes. And the chorus spits this out sort of to old newsreel music, pop, 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 pop. It's just a nervous sort of staccato underneath. And they sing, the end of June 1945 finds us expecting from day to day to hear of the explosion of the first atomic bomb devised by man. All the problems are believed to have been solved, at least well enough to make a bomb practicable. A sustained neutron chain reaction resulting from nuclear fission has been demonstrated. Production plants of several different types are in operation, building a stockpile of the explosive material. We do not know when the first explosion will occur, nor how effective it will be. This devastation of a single bomb is expected to be comparable to that of a major air raid by usual methods. A weapon has been developed that is potentially destructive beyond the wildest nightmares of the imagination. A weapon so ideally suited to sudden unannounced attack that a country's major cities might be destroyed overnight by an ostensibly friendly power. This weapon has been created not by the devilish inspiration of some warped genius, but by the arduous labor, change of key here, but by the arduous labor of thousands of normal men and women working for the safety of their country. So we get this sort of buzz of an old newsreel, the sort of black and white little news, what would they call, movie tone news that they would play in a movie theater right before, Clark Gable and Betty Davis came on. And again, this is a real document. So the libretto is this unusual mixture of that kind of material and then the poetry.
So the question is, how do you take this incredibly imaginative yet unusual and non-typical libretto and turn it into a new stage production? Penny.
Well, I think you go from complete terror, really. It was a sort of interesting process because I had what John has there, the annotated libretto that had all the sources, and I rather sort of, rather nerdish way went back and read every single book that you referenced there, because in some cases there could be a verse in which maybe 4 different books had been drawn from different books. So I read all the books and tried to get my head, because I really knew nothing about it before. When I was a little girl growing up, I think there was this idea that the atomic bomb had been this very good thing and that had finished the war. And I didn't really question that as a child. And then I suppose as I grew up and became the kind of renegade who Peter was describing earlier, I felt, we would go on peace demonstrations and, everybody was against the bomb, but somehow I never joined these things up, and I had sort of imagined somehow that the scientists were very perhaps narrow-minded militaristic types, and this has been a huge journey to discover. Of course, they were people rather like us, you know. The General Groves said they were the biggest bunch of crackpots he'd ever met in his life. And so in a way, there's this huge amount of work. Perhaps it's not unlike science, that you get these flashes of kind of inspiration, and then there's a huge amount of work that you do in order to see whether or not that your hunch is right, you know. And I always loved the story of Leo Szilard having this notion that splitting the atom could cause a nuclear chain reaction, that he had this idea as he was crossing the road and the traffic lights changed, you know, that, and then there was sort of years of work to find out whether or not he was right. So, I mean, really, I read a lot, and then Julian and I got together, as I was saying, this very shabby neighbourhood in North London, this rather tiny room with a model of the Met, which they give you, which is a scale model. It looks like a large doll's house. And we would play the music and sort of tear our hair out and wander around and talk to ourselves, which we sort of somehow managed to do from the beginning without any shame, isn't it? And then ideas would sort of emerge, didn't they?
It's true. I sort of feel nervous coming here because I didn't do a huge amount of research. Penny did so much research, and I didn't. But my role was to be the expert because I'd already done one other opera. So I was,
and in Sanskrit also.
I was like I was the expert. And
Julian co-directed and designed Satyagraha, which is also in Sanskrit.
That was all Sanskrit. And I don't feel I did it's funny because you don't. I had a friend who built most of the model. So you build a model, a scale model, and my friend and most of that was we sat and looked and tried bits of paper. And I think it's very hard when people say, "Where did you get the idea for that?" Because it's very hard to trace it all back. Really, I think we knew that we had to do something simple. So we spent a lot of time trying to find the simple things, trying to find the simple ingredients. Penny had come in, well, when the very first time I talked to you, you talked about this Cornelia Parker work, which I think is probably best if you talk about it because I always forget the names of things. But it was about blackboards and chalk, really.
Well, Cornelia Parker is an English sculptor, and she's very interested in science. And she'd done a piece with 3 photographs called Einstein's Abstracts. And there's that very famous photograph of Einstein standing in front of a blackboard with lots of equations behind it. And she had photographed some of the chalk dust that fell off one of the numbers and had magnified it millions of times. And what it looks like is a galaxy. So you have this dust against the blackboard that suddenly becomes the Milky Way or something. And I was interested in that. And Julian had a very old book of Polish theatre design that had some mountains made out of cloth. And we sort of grabbed onto these tiny things.
Yes.
And, you know, for me as a filmmaker, I suppose, filmmaking feels so literal in comparison, because sometimes we would have a scene where Kitty Oppenheimer would be singing in her bedroom and overlapping, thank you very much, with one of the scientists with an aria in the desert at the same time. And obviously if you're making a film, you can simply cut from the bedroom to the desert to a lab. But we had to make everything happen inside this shape, you know, this box. And initially I thought I would find it incredibly constraining, but actually it was enormously liberating as well, because you have this, in some ways actually having this constraint means that you can be much more inventive too, and inside of that, rather than being able to do whatever you like, and much less literal, which actually I've really enjoyed. It's been rather delirious sort of experience, really.
Can you describe some of the other scenic elements? I mean, I know that you, for example, had to sort of bring New Mexico, the land of New Mexico, into the stage.
Well, I mean, I think it's, I find, and sometimes I question whether it's good practice or whether it's habit, but what I'll normally do, starting any project out, is I'll try and find some materials that seem to somehow be right for that world. And I think this chalk thing, this idea that small is also big, so the atoms are like galaxies. I found that very interesting, and I knew that I couldn't make a desert, that I wasn't up to making a desert, and I knew that if I did, I wouldn't be very popular with the Met or all that sand. And so you kind of have, if you're trying to do something that's like the natural world, you kind of have to go somewhere else. You don't. If you have to create the sea, you can't really bring the water, and the water's never going to be as good as the sea. A bit of sand will never be the desert. So you try and find something else. And I suppose, I think somewhere in our talks we talked to, and we went there eventually. We went to Los Alamos after we designed it, certainly the first stage. But we talked about, we'd read about how it was very beautiful, and how, of course, this little kind of small town, military town, moves in and flattens everything, and it becomes about that. And so I sort of wanted to see. There's some soundscapes at the beginning of each act, and
which are part of the composition.
Yeah, they're part of the composition, but unusual in opera, I guess. But it was a kind of opportunity for a certain number of minutes of something happening with no performers, and so I wanted to start with pretty much an empty stage, and I wanted to see the mountains formed, and I wanted to see the stars go up into the sky, although they're not quite the stars. It's sort of debris, which is then used again for the explosion. I felt I wanted to have things hanging in the air all the way through. So we sort of create a kind of landscape from sheets that look a bit like tarpaulins and some...
It's not that we can't afford good scenery.
No. No. In fact, that's even more expensive, isn't it?
Yes. Very large sheets.
And burnt bits of wood, and the feeling was to do that and then see basically the scientists and the military move in, so that I made these big cubicles, which are not historically accurate. I mean, it's a stylized, distilled picture of what maybe it was like, but it's an intuitive process, and actually when you do it, you don't know whether you're doing the right thing, and it's only when it's only in the last few moments you find out whether you've done the right thing or not. And we weren't sure for a long time whether sonically it was going to help the voices, and I think it really does. But it was, there was a gamble in that. It's also very high up, so you weigh all these things, and it's really, it's in some ways you do feel the stakes are not as high, but you do feel a bit like these scientists working where you don't know what you're going to end up with at the end of the day.
The issue or the question of the soundscape is an interesting one, particularly for the Metropolitan Opera, as you know, John, because the Metropolitan Opera is famous, as most opera houses are, for being a house of natural acoustics. And yet, John's composing involves extra electronic sound elements. So in fact, before we went into rehearsal, we actually wired the Met. We put speakers into various parts of the Met that are now will be there permanently, hopefully to serve your future operas that you create for us. But could you describe how you incorporate electronic sound in a?
Well, I've always done it. It's probably just that I grew up like you, listening to music more often than not through loudspeakers, and for me, the microphone and the loudspeaker and the synthesizer and nowadays the computer, they're all as much a part of the musical experience as a violin or a cello or a human singing voice. And I have certainly have written lots of music that doesn't involve electronics, mostly orchestra music, but in my stage works, I want to create a magical space. And I am absolutely certain that if Richard Wagner were alive today, he would be using all of this technology, because look at what he did with technology. He inherited the opera as it was for Donizetti and Bellini, and then by the end of his life, he had invented all these new instruments, the special brass instruments, and he had created this whole technology of instrumentation and built a theater to, you know, to have it under its ideal circumstances, Bayreuth. And so particularly with Dr. Atomic, I wanted to use electronic instruments because this is an opera about technology. I mean, it's the opera about how to make an atomic bomb. And the first thing I thought of was to have these what I call soundscapes. And so the opera actually begins with how long is it, about 3 minutes or 2 minutes? It's a musique concrète composition. Now, those of you who don't know your contemporary music history probably don't know what musique concrète is, but it was a style of making electronic music back in the old days of tape recorders, where you made things by recording something on a length of tape and then literally with Scotch tape, taping it to the next link. And you know, composers made these very primitive pieces out of doors squeaking or trucks driving by or oscillators or radio. John Cage, Stockhausen did that sort of thing. So I made this musique concrète composition that opens the performance, and it's all industrial sounds. It's sort of jackhammers and lathes and drill bits, and I don't get too analytical about it. I'm not trying to say anything particular, but it gives you this feeling of, you know, we're in this environment where things are being made. And then we hear this, the sound modulates into the sound of a very large airplane taking off, and then suddenly the orchestra just shocks everybody by coming in on this very threatening, sort of hyper-amped emotional state, which is my memory of listening to or watching science fiction movies in the mid-1950s when I was a little boy. And that's how I learned about the atomic bomb, was by watching these bad old science fiction movies where, you know, a nuclear test in the Nevada desert would go wrong and suddenly, you know, a monster would come out. So I sort of set the tone that way. I mean, this is a very, very serious opera, but I set the tone by saying we're kind of back then. Not even the 40s. It's real a 50s thing, because I don't remember the 40s. I wasn't around then. But I used electronic music. You don't hear much more of it in the first act, but in the second act, which is this big, long dreamscape, it's like a 90-minute symphony with moments of scientists and military people shouting each other, and this enormous tension of, is the bomb going to work or not? And then these sudden moments of just sort of hallucinatory images. And so there's electronic music just pouring out of the, you know, all corners of the auditorium. And in order to make this into all one unified, integrated experience, I mic the voices, but they're not, you know, crudely mic'd, let's say, like in a Broadway show or something, but they're very, very subtly mic'd. But it is always, you know, people ask me this question as if, you know, well, is this amplified? Well, yes, it is. Of course it is, the way I want it. And, you know, it's a controversial thing because there are purists, there are operatic purists who feel that this is, you know, the beginning of the end. You know, for the grand opera tradition, but of course it isn't. You know, I mean, we've had synthesizers and microphones and electric guitars, but we still have Yo-Yo Ma. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it isn't one thing's going to supplant the other. They're just going to live in tandem.
Well, it's a very having sat through the rehearsals, it's a very effective, and I think it's going to be very, in fact, it's so effective for the audience that we actually are putting a warning in the program, warning the audience that they're allowed
turn on your
loud sound effects.
But I do have to say that you, Peter, are so extraordinary here because, you know, he has just completely supported us creatively on every step of the way, all the things that we wanted to do, and my vision of what contemporary opera should be, along with the technology. And you know, a lot of opera directors kind of grit their teeth and, you know, they'll keep running back to the sound booth and saying, "Oh, please turn that down," and just not
I told
letting
him
us.
to crank it up.
Yeah, right. He says, "Crank it up."
And then he tighten the harness, though, don't you?
The contrast to the soundscape, of course, is the beautiful lyrical arias in the opera, and I thought, you know, you got a little bit of a preview of it in the trailer we played earlier, but there's a lengthier excerpt of the aria, the beautiful aria that Gerald Finley as Dr. Oppenheimer sings at the end of Act 1 from the John Donne poem. And we have an excerpt of that from the earlier production of Dr. Atomic, which was recorded in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, this summer. So we're going to play that for you now.
Could I just say one thing before, just to say what's going on here? This is what we call the bedroom scene, and Oppenheimer's had this extraordinarily complicated and you know, equally brilliant wife, Kitty, who was miserable all the time she was in Los Alamos, because she was just expected to be, you know, sort of a faculty wife and just hold cocktail parties and do the laundry. And she herself was a scientist, and so she was very unhappy and she drank a lot. So we wanted to have a scene where, you know, we really see the electricity between the two of them. And you know, she's just finished singing this aria, which is, it's both loving and sort of ironic. Am I in your light? And she's trying to get his attention, and he gets on the bed. He doesn't even, in your production, he doesn't even take his clothes off. He just lies there. He immediately takes out his reports, and she finally gets his attention. So his way of making love to her is he sings this long Baudelaire poem. So that's what we'll see.
But I think that's not what we're
I think
going
we're
to see,
actually-
though.
Is this?
Is it?
You know, but let's.
It isn't?
I think it's
we're
the
going
Batter
to
My
see Batter My
Batter My
Oh, is this
Heart,
Batter
yeah.
My Heart?
Yeah.
Okay. I talked about that earlier. That's the John Donne poem.
Right.
Okay.
Batter my heart, three-personed God, for you as yet, but knock, breathe, knock, breathe, knock, breathe, shine and seek to mend. Batter my heart, three-personed God, that I may rise and stand. O'erthrow me and bend your force to break, blow, break, blow, break, blow, burn. knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend. Batter my heart, three-personed God, that I may rise and stand, o'erthrow me and bend your force to break, blow, break, blow, break, blow, burn, and make me new. I, like an usurped town, to another due, labor to admit you, but oh, to no end. Reason, your viceroy in me should defend, but is captived, or proves weak or untrue. Yet dearly I love you, and would be loved fain, but am betrothed unto your enemy. Divorce me, untie, or break that knot again. Take me to you, imprison me, for I, except you enthrall me, never shall be free, nor ever chaste, except you ravish me.
So, you know, I thought it might be interesting for the audience to understand how you, Penny, create, working with the singers who are also actors, how you create the roles that they, working with them, how you create the roles that they portray. Could you describe the process?
Sort of combination of things. I suppose I had worked with the singers. I'd worked with singers once before on The Death of Klinghoffer, and really, as a director, I'm the same. Whether I'm making a documentary or directing a fiction film or an opera, it's somehow, casting I think is really about 80% of it, you know, and if you get the casting right, really what you have to do is make the space for that person to be as good as they can be, you know. And in this case, there were obviously some other things as well. Actually, I worked with a friend of Julian's, a brilliant choreographer, Andy Dawson, and we talked very much about how the way somebody walks, you know, can be a key to the character. And Andy said something very simple that I think was sort of helpful, which was that the scientists sort of walk leading with by their heads, you know, and they're sort of always on the balls of their feet, kind of moving forward like that. And that the military people would lead through their chests, you know, and that's a very different way to come into the world. And so that was one thing. And actually there was a third group at Los Alamos who the Tewa, who were a village of Pueblo Native Americans, and every day an army truck would pick up really the entire population of this village and take them up to the top of the mesa, where they would do the kind of cleaning and the soaking of the furnaces and so on. And they had their own very powerful alternative cosmology, which I became very interested in as well. And different memoirs that I read were saying that they moved slower than everyone else. So the Anglos, as they call us, always rushing about, you know, and the scientists were very much following their heads, and that the Tewa would move much more calmly, much more slowly, at a very steady pace. So that was one kind of helpful thing when at times we've got about 120, 130 people on stage, was to distinguish the groups through the way that they moved. And I'm very interested in smoking, and as an ex-smoker myself, I mean, I love smoking, and I always thought it was a very glamorous thing to do, and I couldn't wait to grow up so I could smoke and be very artistic. That was I associated. And of course, at that time, everybody smoked, and Oppenheimer was a chain smoker, as was his wife. And so this idea that all these people, and there's an aria, such a very beautiful aria, where the doctor explains about the dangers of radiation and the fact it can cause cancer, and we decided he should smoke throughout his aria, because of course at that time that connection hadn't been made. So there was sort of smoking, the way people moved, and also really because we know who these people were. I mean, we know that Edward Teller would eventually betray Oppenheimer at the hearings and testify against him and say he was unreliable politically, and Oppenheimer's security clearance was revoked, and he was really a broken man after that. And then, because I knew that was going to happen, it was somehow laying the seeds for that, because this was not, Teller at that time was a much more thoughtful man and still a very great friend of Leo Szilard's, but that he would have really liked to be director of the project himself, and then was also very jealous of Hans Bethe. And so somehow knowing that, I sort of gave Oppenheimer a little group of people, because I'd read that he always was followed around by his students. Perhaps you were one of them who, you know, in some cases even copied the way he was smoking, the way that he stood and so on, you know, and that Teller was somehow excluded from this group. And so there are ways of trying to psychologically bring out what I had understood about these characters.
Is each character meant to be historically accurate?
To some extent. I mean, we know that Robert Wilson, who was this young idealistic scientist who very strongly agreed with Szilard and had his own petition, was suggesting that instead of dropping the bomb on a civilian target, they should have a demonstration of the bomb, a test, and invite Japanese observers to see it and say, this is what we've got, you should surrender now. And you know, Oppenheimer wouldn't listen, and the petition never got to Truman, who probably would have ignored it even if it had. But you know, I've seen footage of Wilson, and he was, you know, tremendous kind of, you know, idealistic, sincere, interesting, very lively person. And I met Robert Christie, who I'm sure you remember, in California. He's still at Caltech. And he was saying, really, he said, Bob Wilson was the only one who was thinking about it, because we were all so busy and so excited. But he was the only one, and he remembered standing next to him at the test, and everybody was thrilled, you know, that it had worked. And actually there's a story about Richard Feynman playing the bongos on the bonnet of a car, and they had a party and got drunk in the desert. And Bob Christie said he saw Wilson on the floor with his head in his hands, and he said, "What's the matter with you?" And he said, Bob said, "What have we done?" You know, so knowing those things has been something I've talked to Thomas Glenn about, who's playing Wilson, that actually, and Oppenheimer loved him. I mean, he was a special student. So when Robert Wilson says to him, from radical to establishment figure in 2 easy stages, I think that's hurtful for Oppenheimer, because he didn't want to be seen as the establishment guy. So these, you know, you work with people to somehow be really thinking about what they're saying, because I think when people are singing in Czech, for example, and they don't actually understand the words because they don't, it's a language they don't know, they're basically counting and saying syllables that they've learned, kind of like a parrot, you know, and they have some sense of the context of it. But this is an opera in English, and I think it's really important that people understand what's being said and feel that it's coming from, you know, to be respectful to the people who originally said those words. So it was sort of a process of, you know, between us, Alan Gilbert, the conductor, and I, what happens is that you're in this rehearsal room for several weeks, which is a great big barn of a room with bits of tape on the floor that tell you where things are going to be, and a piano.
Before it gets on stage.
Before it gets on stage. And this is the period where, you know, I would stop people or maybe question certain rather operatic gestures, which I personally don't like very much. You know, I sort of feel that if you go like this, you know, it doesn't look real even if you're very far away. So I suppose I'm more interested in a more naturalistic kind of performance, which is different perhaps to.
But you know, in Gerald Finley, you have one of the leading veterans. Sounds too much because he's quite young, but he's, you know, he starred on the stages of the world's leading opera houses, singing the, you know, roles like Don Giovanni and you know, all the great baritone roles in the repertoire. But in contrast to that, Sasha Cook, who was we saw a little bit in the trailer earlier, who plays Kitty Oppenheimer, actually this is her debut in a leading role, and she was a member of the Metropolitan Opera's Young Artist Program. I think she may still be a member of it, in fact. And so,
not after Monday.
Not after Monday. So, so how did you develop the role of Kitty Oppenheimer with her? Surely she needed a lot more.
Well, we heard a lot of singers, didn't we? Right. And I remember sometimes you remember the first time you meet somebody, and Sasha sort of burst into the room where she was slightly late, and she sashayed in, pianist, and she looked so sexy and kind of confident and comfortable in her skin, and I remember thinking, I really hope she can sing, you know, because, and then she opened her mouth and she has this beautiful kind of, I love her because it really sounds like kind of molten gold, really, her voice. So, and I was very interested because there's only one really scene in the film that's about love rather than death and destruction, and I really wanted to have that, somebody who understood that. So I asked her whether she'd ever been in love, and she said, I've been doing my research this summer. So, and whether she'd ever had too much to drink, because this is the other thing, and you know, she's the young woman, I've certainly had too much to drink at different times in my life myself, and she assured me that she had. And I think those were important things, because, you know, Kitty was the big drinker, but people who don't know about, the people who are drunk generally are trying to appear sober. So one of the things that I wouldn't have liked her to do is to sort of totter around, or, you know, because that's kind of bad drunken acting, whereas somebody who's...
But that's very common in the opera world.
Yeah.
You say to an opera singer, okay, now you're drunk, and...
people start tumbling around.
Yeah,
and, you know, it's really not what people
everything
do.
Is exaggerated.
So Sasha was just, I mean, she was a gift, really. She has a beautiful voice, and because it's such, you know, obviously a big thing for her, you know, to go to, I think she'd done 1 or 2 really tiny parts, and it's, you know, Peter's saying she's still on the Young Musicians program, to suddenly get this leading role, and she studied really hard, so she turned up knowing it inside out, so then we could just work on. I went to see Rose Bader, Hans Bader's widow, and I asked her about Kitty, and she said she remembered different things, and then she did this fantastic sort of impression of her, and she said, this is how she walked. And suddenly Rose, who's sort of 90, looked like this young woman swaggering around with a cigarette. And it was this moment where I suddenly could see her, and Sasha was with me, and we were both, that was something that we could use, you know. So it's really fun, all of that. But, you know, it's all about the music, and I hope we haven't given you the impression that this is sort of some kind of Stockhausen dissonant piece, because actually it's very, very beautiful, and the music is ravishing, and, you know, it's all about
well,
that, really.
You know, I think certainly the goal for the Met is to present works, whether they're standard repertory works or brilliant new works like this, as a complete musical theatrical experience. And that's why, you know, we're so excited about this production, because I think it represents exactly that. And the balance between all these elements is really ultimately what determines, I think, whether a production is successful or not. And you know, I think that Julian, you know, maybe you could talk a little bit more about some of the, you know, you said how simple everything was, but it really isn't quite so simple. In fact, this production uses technology, animation and video technology that I don't think we've ever put on the stage of the Met before. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, there's, I think, again, from the idea of the chalk, we decided it would be interesting to see the blackboards write themselves at various points, and so we got some projection in, and we started taking projection on a journey with this, and really in Act 2 there's such a kind of dream world that it almost needs that extra layer, and we don't use it. It's not really a narrative element. It's not a narrative aid. It's another atmospheric level. But you know, there's some great things. I mean, there's some things that you just want to see. Like I think we saw a clip of it of the ID cards that they all had, and you know, you see
those are the actual.
They're the actual ones projected up there, and you know, in Oppenheimer, you know, there's Oppenheimer. Then there's a cleaner down there, and they have exactly the same cards, and they had to show them all the time, and so we use them a little bit, yeah, I mean, a fantastic team, a great costume designer, Kathy Zuber, who's, I think, got some huge number of Tony Awards.
Most recently for South Pacific.
That's right. And Brian McDevitt, the lighting designer, just, it looks extraordinary. I mean, I'm very lucky because I get a lot of credit for the set, but actually the set is nothing without the lights. And Brian, I think this is his first job, isn't it?
This is Brian McDevitt, the lighting designer's debut at the Met. He lit Coast of Utopia, amongst other distinguished works.
That's a fantastic job, and he dovetails with the project. It's the same projection team who did Satyagraha with me, 59 Productions, and they're from the UK. But they work so well together with the lighting designer, which is a crucial.
This is a whole new aspect of theatrical production, at least for the Opera House, of combining, using projected images as a light source.
Yes.
Combined with the light, with more conventional lighting.
And it's tricky, and you have to be careful with it. I think we use it well because we're fairly suspicious of it. You have to, you can't just throw anything. Well, you can. That's the trouble. You can throw anything. So you have to choose very carefully what you're using. So there's a real world that comes from.
Could you describe the making of the Scenic bomb that is in our production?
I didn't make it. I didn't make it, but a man who made it was totally obsessed with it. Totally obsessed with it.
They usually are.
He researched it forever and ever, and I had to go out and have a look at it.
Where was this made in?
He built it in his garage at the back of his house, and he built it. I went around to have a look at it, and he was also doing the burnt debris. And so this is like an anecdote now, but I found out his wife was divorcing him at the same time, and they actually they were actually in the middle of a kind of who looks after children, and they were his obsession with. He's an armourer as well for films, and his obsession with weaponry was mentioned as one of the factors. And there he was in his.
But in the divorce.
Yeah, apparently, and there he was at the time building this absolutely accurate. And of course he researched it, and he made bits to put in, and he understood exactly how the plutonium worked, and And then, of course, they had the problem of they.
You haven't looked inside of it, though. You don't.
I half expected. Funny enough, I half expected him to be inside it. I don't know what. But of course, they had to send it here, and they couldn't write bomb on it. They couldn't write atomic bomb. They had to be incredibly.
It was built
from England.
Yes, it was built in Essex in England, and they. I can't remember what they described it as, but it certainly wasn't bomb.
a sphere, wasn't it? A sphere?
It was something like a scientific sphere or something. It was something like that. But anyway, it was. I had to do very little because he was so driven. He was so driven by this thing, terribly excited.
I have to tell a story. When Dr. Atomic was premiered in San Francisco, they also had an absolutely life-size model of the plutonium sphere. And it was constructed in the San Francisco Opera's shop, which is not in downtown San Francisco. And there's actually a documentary movie made by John Else called Wonders Are Many, which is sort of chronicles the first production and the creation of the libretto and the set. And you see this amazing and very, very alarming shot of the plutonium bomb being moved from the opera's shop in South San Francisco to the Opera House, which is right smack in the middle of San Francisco. And they put it on the back of a flatbed truck and just covered it with a tarp that said San Francisco Opera on it, and drove it right downtown, and nobody stopped them. So
that's the way to do it.
So what scenic challenges are left for you now that you've designed the atomic bomb, Julian? What's your next challenge?
Oh, just this little thing at the Met Opera with 25 arias. I'm doing the gala for that. That's a challenge because you come in and it gets changed around, or the order gets changed around every day. So that's one of my challenges. My other challenge is I'm doing the Addams Family on Broadway as a musical. So. It's another Adams project, you see. This is it's all I only do things with the Adams and connected somehow.
And Penny, would you do another opera after this?
I definitely would. It's been, and also I'd love to do it again without having to do everything for the first time in my life. It's sort of arriving and suddenly being thrown into a lighting tech with about 350 people waiting for me to tell them what to do is. I'd love to have done it once before. I'd feel like at least I had some idea. But no, it's been really, really, I don't know if fun is exactly the word for it. There have been moments, sometimes in the rehearsal room downstairs, and the singers will start singing some beautiful aria. And I was sort of in tears quite often. So I was thinking, here I am with these great singers just singing for me in this room, That was really joyful. And then
I'm sure you'll do more. And it's interesting. I think you're like a real natural at it. I'm sure. I just have a feeling around it. I think you'll be doing less films and more operas.
Yeah. Anyway, it's been amazing experience. I just feel so lucky. It's like this sort of gift, really. That's been fun.
Well, I certainly hope you do more operas. How do you, John, imagine your next project? I know you said, I read somewhere that you said that after you do an opera, and of course you've written an opera between Dr. Atomic and today, The Flowering Tree. But I read somewhere that you said that you need a year or two to recover after you write one, and then the bug grabs you again. Are you thinking about a future opera?
Well, yeah, I always am. The thing about writing for the stage for a composer that's so stimulating and gratifying is that you are prompted to get out of yourself because you're presented with all these absurd things that you have to do, like you have to figure out how to musically portray Air Force One landing on the tarmac of Peking, as I did in Nixon in China, or, musically evoke what it's like to be waiting in a bunker at dawn on the New Mexico desert, waiting for the explosion of the first atomic bomb. And that takes you out of your normal mode. You don't usually have those thoughts when you're writing a string quartet. You tend to fall back on certain modes. So for me, writing for the stage always prompts me to go beyond myself, imaginatively and musically. Plus, I just love the intellectual ferment of it. Because I choose my themes from our contemporary experience, I read and I research, and just as Penny said, she took every footnote and every book in the bibliography and read it all. And in the case of writing Nixon in China, I just saturated myself with the history of China and reading Mao's poetry and his little red book and all these studies about the Cultural Revolution, and also reading about Nixon and Kissinger as well. And here, those of you who were lucky enough to be here earlier in the afternoon and to hear these scientists and historians talk about the science and the personalities involved, to me, that's just, I feel like I'm more alive at these points in my life than any other time. And so, yes, I do want to write another opera. The thing that's so hard is it's extremely difficult to find the nucleus, because, I think one of the great mistakes that composers make is that they pick a novel that they like, and they try to make an opera out of a big novel. And whether it's a famous novel or not famous novel, it almost always is a failure, because there's just so much to deal with in terms of time and space and characterization. And with an opera, you really have to find, when I said a nucleus, I mean, think of that plutonium sphere of just incredibly dense material. And that's what you want. You want a subject, and you also want a compact time. For example, Dr. Atomic, except for the first scene, it all takes place in about a 12-hour period. And my second opera, The Death of Klinghoffer, which is about a hijacking of a pleasure cruiser by 4 Palestinians, a real true story, in 1985, I think it was. That was, what, 72 hours, roughly?
3 days, yeah.
So you want something that has that kind of, absolutely loaded, super critical focus to it. And then you can radiate out. You can radiate backwards in time or forwards in time, and characterization. So I'm looking for something that has the emphatic, gripping image of the atomic bomb. I mean, let's face it, we're people of the theater. We need to get your attention. And we want to invite you in. We want to communicate with you, but we also have to entertain you. I mean, Mozart understood that. He understood that he could, if he's going to get your attention to talk about something very, very serious, like what Don Giovanni is about, he has to also entertain you. And I'm using entertainment on a very, very high level, because this is a very, very serious opera. But at the same time, it needs to be a theatrical experience that makes you leave the theater satisfied, and so I'm searching for that. And of course, I'm looking in my own life. I'm looking for in the American experience, and I'm sure I'll find something soon.
Well, I'm sure everyone is looking forward to it, particularly me.
Thank you, Peter.
I want to allow time for questions from the audience, and we should open the floor up to questions now. And before doing so, I want to thank you, John, Penny, and Julian, so much for sharing your time with us today. I'd also like to add that Dr. Atomic is not the only John Adams opera. Besides the future opera that we hope John will be inspired to write, we are presenting in 2 years' time a production of Nixon in China, which was John's first great masterpiece. So, on that note, I'd be very happy to, I'm sure Penny and Julie and John would be happy to answer some questions.
Who was there in the domestic scene between Kitty and Oppie that you could include that in the libretto?
Pardon?
Well, the domestic scene is part of the historical record?
Is it historical record? I assume that they slept together.
They're not singing to.
What's the poem?
They sing.
They sing. I mean, they. Well, go ahead.
Well, they sing the poetry of a poet called Muriel Rukeyser. So actually, this is one of the poetic sections of the opera that isn't based on historical record. And Muriel Rukeyser was mainly wrote in the 60s, actually. So she wrote later. She was again rather like Oppenheimer, a New York radical, secular Jewish woman. And actually, funnily today, I was walking around New York with my friends, and we were near the public library, and we saw this plaque in the floor. And I stopped at this plaque, and it said, "The universe is made out of stories, not of atoms." Muriel Rukeyser. It was a lovely thing to see just before coming here. So that's what that is. So she sings a poem of Muriel Rukeyser, and Oppenheimer responds with a poem by Baudelaire. So we're not trying to pretend that this is what they actually said.
I'm Kathleen McCarthy, and I'm here at the Graduate Center on the History faculty. I was at the dress rehearsal production the other day, and it is a magnificent opera and a magnificent production. Congratulations to all of you. But one of the most visually stunning scenes was the one with the Indians, the local Indians up in the cubicles. And I was surprised not to see that in the trailer. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the relationship between the local Indian community and the scientists, and also that particular scene, which was astonishing.
Yeah.
Well, in the libretto, there's one character called Pascualita, who's a maid who sings in Act 2, actually.
The Oppenheimer's maid.
The Oppenheimer's maid. And for me, it was slightly puzzling, actually. I wasn't sure who she was initially. And so I basically did quite a lot of research. And meeting Robert Christie, who's the first of the scientists I met, I said, were there any Native Americans around? And he said they were everywhere. And every day he explained how people would come up and they would do all the jobs on the, and that they would wear their own sort of ethnic clothes and do their work and then go home. And I also then was reading some other memoirs where they described that at certain times the Tewa would have these special dances that they would do and invite the scientists to come and watch them take part in their culture. And then a friend of Julian's, who's actually a British comedian, turned out to be a rather, absolutely, in fact, quite obsessed with the Tewa and knew a lot about them. So he told me some books to read, and one of the things that interested me was apparently these dances that they do at the beginning of every season, that the purpose of the dances is to keep the universe in its place, to keep the sun in the sky, the moon where it's supposed to be, and the stars and so on. And it seemed to me interesting that they were dancing to keep things together, and what the scientists were working on was about really the destruction of the natural order. So there's one person who sings, and then I tried to sort of somehow give you as the audience an experience that she's part of a community, and that community, that they have their own thoughts. And in one of the books that I read, apparently, I mean, they're pretty uninterested. When Julian and I went to the area and we were trying to find this village, we kept driving past it because there was no sign saying this is where it is. They're not interested in us. They don't want to be a tourist attraction. They have no interest in capitalism whatsoever. So the Navajo make these Hopi dolls and things and sell them. They just, apparently they think that, you know, the Navajo blew in, blew out, the Spanish came and went, we'll come, we'll go, and they will still be there. And that at some point we will destroy the earth, which will be burnt to a crisp, and they'll be left surviving, and who knows if that's not in fact the case. So that was the sort of thinking behind it.
Sir.
I was struck by your remark about how people walk is a clue to their character. And then a moment later, you talked about Edward Teller and his odd man out aspect in this drama. But you may be aware that Teller walked with a limp.
Yes.
And it occurred to me, are you using that in the opera? I think that says a lot about his role in the piece.
Do you know, in the end I decided not to, because he had an accident as a young man. He sort of leapt off an electric tram, I think, and his foot was severed. So he had a prosthetic foot. But because he, you know, became this sort of bit of a sort of demonized figure, I thought the thought of him sort of limping around without the audience actually knowing that this was, you know, where that came from, it sort of seemed unfair, and in the end I didn't do it actually, but you know, it was one of these things I struggled with a bit.
I have two questions for the composer. The first one is that this opera not only draw huge attention in the music community, but also draw huge attention from the physics community. Do you get some feedback after your first performance? And the second question is that I read an interview from the Opera News, which is about, you say that you revise the score a little bit because of some of the main character is played by different singers. So my question is that this kind of some change in the score will that change the image of the character a little bit? Thank you.
I didn't get the first question.
The first question was the feedback from the physics community after the first performance. Yeah.
Well, first of all, to answer the second question first, it's really funny. Everybody wants to know about revisions, but if I write an orchestra piece, nobody ever asks me about revisions. And actually, I tend to revise those more than I do my theater pieces. I actually was pretty satisfied with the shape of Dr. Atomic, and I didn't do any large-scale revision at all. I added a brief scene for Kitty, for Oppenheimer's wife, right before the final countdown, because she had sort of mistakenly just kind of disappeared, and we needed to bring her back. And I've moved some of the vocal lines around because we started my original plan. I actually composed this role for the great American mezzo Lorraine Hunt Lieberson, who tragically died at a very young age. So then I moved it up into the soprano range for Jessica Rivera, who's a wonderful soprano, and who is actually on this, the DVD that you saw, not Peter's trailer, but the one that was produced in Amsterdam. And she's a singer who can go up to high C, high D, and I moved some pitches up there for her. And then now with Sasha Cook, who so beautifully embodies this role dramatically, but Sasha's a mezzo, so I had to move pitches down. And I have to tell you that it's really hard to do that, because once you get a pitch where you want it, it is the only pitch. And it's just bloody murder to try to find another pitch. And I'll have to reshape the line altogether, and it can be very, very frustrating, but I'm pretty happy with the way it came out. The second question was the feedback from the physics community. Well, the first feedback I got was from nobody special, just Marvin Cohen, president of the American Physics Association, who wrote me and said, I'm a big fan of yours. He'd come to a workshop, and he said, I think it's a brilliant opera, and I'm a clarinet player myself, so I love music, and however, your opening line is not correct. And I'll tell you what it was, because I had taken this line from this book, Atomic Energy for Military Purposes, and I started the opera with the chorus singing, "Matter can be neither created nor destroyed, but only altered in form." And I thought, well, isn't that what E equals mc squared means? Because, you know, you're altering it in form. You're altering mass and changing it to energy, and that's an alteration in form, but I guess not. So I've now changed it, so the chorus sings, "We believed that." But now we know that is no longer so. And other than that, scientists in general have been really thrilled by this opera because they believe that what they're doing is not only immensely important, but that it has as much poetry and excitement and wonder as the creative process in the arts. And they're just absolutely thrilled that a composer and a stage designer and a stage director and these wonderfully talented musicians would join together to create a work that is serious, that asks questions, that hopefully is sensually beautiful and emotionally stirring, and that, you know, celebrates what they do. So that has given me huge satisfaction.
I would just like to add something to on the subject of revisions, because in the history of opera, many of the greatest composers have revised their works numerous times. And you know, one of the points of creating works of musical theater is that there are many different moving artistic parts, and it's only with the benefit of seeing a work performed and seeing how it plays that one can truly understand it from the point of view of the audience. And at that point, sometimes revisions are, you know, come into play. And I think it's the composers and the directors and designers who are willing to make changes that are often the most inspired, because in the end, the results benefit from changes. I don't think there's any. I don't know any. I mean, I'm sure there must be some operas that were perfect from the moment they were conceived, but it's hard to imagine. I mean, I think all the when you look at the history of music, Verdi and Puccini and Wagner and Beethoven, they all were constantly rewriting their works as they got to see them play. I mean, so I think, you know, the very fact that we are, when I first heard Dr. Atomic in San Francisco, I thought it was one of the greatest modern works I'd ever heard, but I felt that that it needed even more in terms of production, which is why I asked John if we could not only present it, but also do a new production, because I thought we could perhaps even serve its dramatic contents to a greater purpose. Please.
Yeah, hi. I first wanted to congratulate you for bringing these works to the Metropolitan Opera. I think that's very exciting for us as listeners to be able to hear them in the great opera house, especially the works of John. I have a question which actually might be a yes or no question, so if the answer is no, I mean, it'll be a very short one, but does the opera at all relate back to the history of American opera or grapple with issues in American opera or any specific American opera at all?
Did you hear the beginning?
Do you mean do it?
You said it's really relates back to the Faust.
Does it relate back to American operas? Well, I don't think so. I mean, there are not a heck of a lot of American operas that I think are at the level of the great, European operas, whether, it's Mozart or Wagner, Debussy, Berg. I mean, to me, the great American theatrical tradition in music is the Broadway musical. And, I grew up on that. My first appearance as a performing musician was the little boy in the sarong in South Pacific. My mother was Bloody Mary. So, that's...
Are there any American operas that really inspire you?
Well, I'm trying to get tickets for the show here. They're hard to come by. But no, I think that my inspirations have definitely been from the great tradition, which is essentially a European. But there's nothing wrong with imagining a new and important tradition of American opera. And I certainly think, the wonderful success that the Met had with Philip Glass's Satyagraha is an example that people now understand that, that this is a work that's something we as Americans can be intensely proud of. It's a serious work. It's about, people and issues that really touch upon our lives, and it's a deeply mysterious and evocative work. So maybe we're looking forward now and saying, well, this is the beginning, and we're going to create a tradition here right in this country.
And certainly we're, at the Met, we're dedicated to presenting important works, both that we are commissioning and also works that have been composed already.
When I was in graduate school, I studied John Donne, and the sonnet, Batter My Heart, was certainly one of my favorites. And I have to tell you that this brought me to tears. I think it's the most beautiful thing that I have ever heard. And I was wondering whether Oppenheimer himself was a reader of John Donne, or whether this was just the writer's inspired idea.
Oh no, Oppenheimer. This was perhaps his favorite poem of all, and in fact, the test site was called Trinity. And the reason he said, and I don't know if this is a little invention, he was not beyond mythologizing himself, but he did later say that he had the Donne poem, Batter My Heart, three-person God, because the three-person God is the Trinity. And no, I know that for sure, that he loved George Herbert, he loved John Donne and those metaphysical poets. And the thing about this poem that is so important is that it's a poem. I don't know of a poem in the English language, not even in Shakespeare, that expresses with such searing intensity the loss of one's soul. That the speaker is asking God literally to destroy him physically, to batter him, to bend him, to burn him, to blow him, to bring him down to nothing. Because he feels that he has been usurped by the devil. As you see, I like a usurped town. I'm to another due. I've become imprisoned by the dark forces, and the only hope for him is literally to be just broken, and then he can rise up again. These images are just astonishing, and I have to say, as a composer, you can write the notes, and hopefully you get them right, but then you have to get a great performer. And I'm afraid of the day I'm going to have to listen to somebody else sing this, because Gerald Finley has done that every time since we did the very first piano rehearsal in San Francisco in 2005. And he just owns this. There's something that speaks to him about this.
It's very beautiful. It would be worth going to the opera just to hear him do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Yes, I teach literature, so I teach Baudelaire and I teach Faust, but I also teach a course called The Arts in New York, and in fact, every year we take our students to an opera, and for many of them it's actually the first opera they will ever see. So I have a very practical question, but I need to explain a practical question of John Adams, which has to do with subtitles. In the past, we did La Bohème, and we did The Marriage of Figaro, and we could have done Don Giovanni this time, but we're thrilled to do Dr. Atomic. And every time when we come back from the opera, they tell me about how emotional and powerful an experience it was, but for the subtitles. They complain that when they read the subtitles, they can't see what's happening on stage. That's one level of complaint, but actually it's a much more interesting question they raise, which is, for them, it's, for a generation that's used to storytelling, going to the opera is a new experience, and getting used to voices and bodies in space and getting used to another mode of expression is challenging. And they find themselves caught every time between wanting to do the normal thing, which is follow the story, or actually falling for the music and letting themselves go into the music. So, you know, your opera is very literary and it's profoundly moving, musically speaking. What shall I tell them? Shall I tell them to turn off the subtitles? Well, we can't see. I don't think we can see the libretto. Shall they should they turn off the subtitles? Just be there for the whole experience? No, they should read the subtitles on.
Oh yeah. I mean, look, I went to see Die Frau im Schatten, which is a very complex story. It's a Strauss opera with a, you know, Hugo von Hofmannsthal's most sort of bizarre and literary libretto. And I remember going to see it in San Francisco where there were no subtitles and enjoying it, but absolutely being clueless. You know, after the first 20 minutes, the rest of the afternoon, because I hadn't studied the libretto in advance, it was just simply listening to beautiful music and not having any idea what was going on. Then I saw it about a year or two later at the Met, and I was able to follow it. And yes, it's true, I'd studied the libretto, but it meant so much more to me. Now the Met has the titles on the back of the seat in front of you, so they don't in any way conflict with what's going on with your vision of the stage, and that's allowed me to make libretti or to commission librettis that are deeply, deep poetry, and I want the audience to hear and to see and also to know exactly what's being sung.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Well, it's very helpful because one of the things I will tell them is that it is an art total, that all the arts are coming together, and having you say you want them to really attend to the libretto is crucial. I'm not sure.
Well,
Puccini would have said that.
Actually, you can turn them off.
I know, I can tell them that, but I'll tell them what you said. Thank you.
Yeah.
Last question, please.
So when scientists communicate with each other and when they think, they do so with very specialized jargon. So I wanted to know if you took this into account or tried to represent it in any way in writing the dialogue. And if so, how did you do it? I guess I have to see it in order to get the answer, but how did you wrestle with that? It's an opera about science. So how did you tuck in the science in a way, or did you tuck in the science in a way that's intelligible to the lay public?
Well, gosh,
I think
why would you make that the last question? I don't think that there's anything in here that's wildly complicated, and I mean, to me, here, Teller says to Oppenheimer, I found a new difficulty with the latest design of the super. The super was Teller's shorthand for the hydrogen bomb. But since I haven't yet thought it through, I'd rather talk about it later. Talk about it now, says Oppenheimer. Teller says no. So they're just little images of how the scientist, in this case what we're pointing out was how Teller was never part of the group. He was always a bit of a problem because he was off on his own thing. I found this on the internet, a description of the atomic bomb, and then I kind of poeticized it a bit. But I wanted to describe how actually aesthetically elegant, I'd even say aesthetically beautiful, the plutonium sphere was, because it was sort of like a soccer ball, and it's so beautifully described in Richard Rhodes' book, The Making of the Atomic Bomb. And I give this to the female chorus. We surround the plutonium core from 32 points spaced equally around its surface. The 32 points are the centers of the 20 triangular faces of an icosahedron interwoven with the 12 pentagonal faces of a dodecahedron. We squeeze the sphere, bring the atoms closer till the subcritical mass goes supercritical. Now, some of that you probably can't quite keep up with, but you get the idea, you know, that it's something that's actually symmetrically very beautiful. But then there's a reference to, you know, how the atoms or the neutrons are squeezed until they go supercritical. And I think most people who are going to spend money for a ticket to this show are likely to have, you know, enough rudimentary science to know what's going on here.
Not me.
But I mean, I keep the science at that level. I mean, it's not like opening a textbook of advanced physics and spitting.
Do you make an effort to supplement those moments with some sort of tool or assistance? So one of your images from.
So we do very occasionally, but it's.
We did with that, because actually I'm one of the sort of imbecilic people who didn't understand it. So we had a little animation film that we found.
I mean, there's old stills taken of that, how that worked, and they've been looked back together again and created. But I'm not sure that necessarily put them together. I mean, I think you don't need to know, you don't need to understand the science to understand the story, actually.
Right. Yeah. But the success ultimately of the production is in the way all of these elements play together, and you'll have to find out by coming Monday.
There we go.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.